Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have our Mox Pearl patron Peter piloting Kenrith the Return King. This is a mid-range deck seeking to grind advantage and win with Thassa's Oracle or Underworld Breach. Peter's opening hand contains a Simian Spirit Guide, Wheel of Fortune, Noble Hierarch, Savannah, Mindbreak Trap, Snap, and a Final Fortune. Next, we have our Mox Pearl patron Nick piloting Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. This deck seeks to slow down the board through stacks pieces and swing for massive damage using its commander. Nick's opening hand contains an Avacyn's Pilgrim, Arid Mesa, Boseiju Who Endures, Sanctum Prelate, Aven Mindcensor, Sunbaked Canyon, and a Boromir, Warden of the Tower. After that, we have Zach piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum Ludovic's Opus. This deck seeks to grind advantage with its commander before going for an Underworld Breach or Thassa's Oracle win. Zach's opening hand contains an Arcane Signet, Dark Ritual, Lion's Eye Diamond, Savannah, Soul Ring, Wheel of Fortune, and a Mox Opal. Finally, we have Zeb piloting Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. This deck seeks to generate lots of treasures with its commander, then win with an Aristocrat-style line. Zeb's opening hand contains a Bright Climb Pathway, Flooded Strand, Animate Dead, Archivist of Ogma, Serra Ascendant, Entomb, and his London Mulligan is an ad nauseum. Without further ado, let's kick off his cushy customary Curtailed Curtsy. Peter did the best 2C slide and gets to start us off. Peter draws a card for turn and plays a Savannah. He casts a Noble Hierarch and passes. Nick draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim. Nick passes. Zach draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Wheel of Fortune. He holds priority, sacrifices LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Wheel of Fortune. Next, he casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Unfortunately disrupted, and with no cards in hand, Zach ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts Serra Ascendant. Zeb ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Rhystic Study. Peter ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. He casts Sardian Avenger. Peter draws through Rhystic, and Nick passes the turn. Zach draws and casts his other commander, Kraum Ludovic's Opus. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Zach moves to combat and attacks Peter with Tymna and Nick with Kraum. They both take it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. Zach ships the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Zeb moves to combat and attacks Peter with Serra Ascendant. Peter takes it, and Zeb gains 6 life. Zeb passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter casts a Witchclaw Talisman and passes the turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Nick flashes in an Aven Mindcensor. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. The turn moves to Nick. During his upkeep, Nick wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He taps Silent Clearing to help cast Sanctum Prelate. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws a card. Sanctum enters and Nick names 1. He casts Boromir, Warden of the Tower. Lotho and Rhystic trigger, Peter draws, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nick moves to combat and attacks Zach with Sardian Avenger. Zach takes 8, and Nick ships the turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tymna. Zeb takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts a Talisman of Creativity, paying for Rhystic. Zach ends his turn. Zeb draws, takes no actions, and passes. Peter draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Elad Domri's Call. In response, Zeb cracks a treasure to flash in an Archivist of Ogma. Sardian Avenger triggers and Zeb loses a life. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Snap, targeting Avon Mind Sensor. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Mind Sensor is bounced and Peter untaps 2 lands. Then Peter fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Archivist of Ogma triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Zeb cracks 2 treasures to help cast Abeyance. Lotho and Sardian Avenger triggers, Zeb loses 2 and then loses 1 more and creates a treasure. In response, Peter exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He activates Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Zeb. Archivist of Ogma triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Abeyance resolves and Zeb draws another card. Then Dockside resolves. It triggers and, in response, Zeb cracks his treasure. Sardian Avenger triggers and Zeb loses a life. Then Peter creates 6 treasures. Peter casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. He cracks 5 treasures, loses through life through Avenger, and then casts his commander, Kenrith, the Return King. With nothing else, Peter passes to Nick. During Nick's upkeep, his Mana Crypt triggers. In response, Peter cracks 2 treasures to cast Final Fortune. Zardian Avenger triggers and Peter loses 2 life. Then Nick loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. He taps Sunbaked Canyon to help cast his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Sardian Avenger. Avenger triggers and, in response, Peter cracks a treasure. Avenger triggers and Peter loses a life. Then Avenger gets +9/+0. Peter blocks with Phantasmal Image. Image dies, and the turn moves to Peter. Peter draws and exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Nick flashes in and Avon Mind Sensor. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Avon resolves, then Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7 cards. Next, Peter casts Underworld Reach. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter escapes Snap, targeting Sardian Avenger. Sardian bounces and Peter untaps 2 lands. He escapes Snap again, targeting Avon Mind Sensor. Sensor bounces and Peter untaps 2 lands again. He casts Mana Crypt. Boromir triggers and counters the spell. He casts Lotus Petal and it gets countered by Boromir again. Now, Peter has enough cards in his graveyard, so he escapes Wheel of Fortune. In response, Zach taps his talisman to cast Snap, targeting Sanctum Prelate. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Sanctum bounces and Zach untaps 2 lands. Still in response, Zach casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Wheel. Lotho and Rhystic trigger, Zach pays, then Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Archivist of Ogma triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Then Flusterstorm counters Wheel of Fortune. Next, Peter escapes Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Zeb cracks his treasures. Then Peter creates 6 treasures of his own. He plays a Tarnished Citadel for turn. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost. In response, Zeb casts Reprieve. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Swan Song. Reprieve is countered, Zeb creates a 2/2 bird, then Evolution resolves. Peter fetches up a Displacer Kitten onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Peter casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 0. Displacer Kitten triggers and flickers Dockside, then Peter creates 6 more treasures. Then Finale resolves and Peter fails to find. Archivist triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Peter escapes Wheel of Fortune. Displacer Kitten triggers, Peter flickers Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. Then everyone discards their hand, with Peter discarding Thassa's Oracle, and then draws 7. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Peter declines to search. He cracks Ranger Captain, locking out opponents this turn. He casts Gamble. Displacer Kitten flickers Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. He fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards a Tainted Pact. He casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Kraum. Displacer Kitten flickers Dockside, Peter creates 6 treasures, and Kraum is destroyed. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Peter wins the game. In this game, Nick's opening hand contains a Gaia's Cradle, Exotic Orchard, Arid Mesa, Wooded Foothills, Avacyn's Pilgrim, Esper Sentinel, and a Professional Facebreaker. Zach's opening hand contains a Lotus Petal, Simian Spirit Guide, Verdant Catacombs, Scrubland, Force of Will, and his Lena Mulligans are Red Elemental Blast and Rite of Flame. Zeb's opening hand contains a City of Brass, Archivist of Ogma, Enlightened Tutor, Orzhov Signet, Reanimate, Cabal Therapy, and a Chrome Mox. Peter's opening hand contains a Mystic Remora, Mana Crypt, Smothering Tithe, Kin and Bonder Prodigy, Force of Negation, Demonic Consultation, and a Scalding Tarn. And Nick gets to start us off. Nick draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim and passes. Zach draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Lotus Petal. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Zach passes. Zeb draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Cabal Therapy. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Zeb ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a Guy's Cradle. He casts Esper Sentinel. Nick passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdict Catacombs. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Tymna. Peter takes it and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Zach gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Lotho. Peter takes it and Zeb passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and casts Birds of Paradise. Peter passes the turn. Nick draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Zeb taps City of Brass to flash in an Archivist of Ogma. In response, Zach cracks his Verdict Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Archivist resolves, and then Nick fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Nick casts Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper and Peter with Avacyn's Pilgrim. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates 2 treasures. Nick ends his turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Tymna. Peter takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach loses a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Command Tower and passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Zeb casts Enlightened Tutor. Remora and Esper trigger, Zeb pays, then Peter draws. Then Zeb fetches up a Bolas's Citadel onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Archivist of Ogma as an additional cost. Mystic and Esper trigger, and both players draw. Then Zeb adds 4 black. He taps City of Brass to help cast Bolas's Citadel. Lotho and Remora trigger, Peter draws, then Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. With no answers, Bolas's Citadel resolves. Zeb pays a life to cast Sarah Ascendant from the top of his library through Bolas's Citadel. He pays a life to cast Springleaf Drum through Citadel. Remora triggers and Peter draws. He pays 2 life to cast Demonic Tutor through Citadel, and Peter draws again. In response, Peter casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card targeting Demonic Tutor. Esper triggers and Nick draws. Then Demonic Tutor is countered and exiled. Next, Zeb pays a life to cast Mana Vault through Citadel, and Peter draws through Remora. He plays Takanuma, Abandoned Mire through Citadel as his land for turn. He pays 7 life to cast Peer into the Abyss. Remora triggers, and in response, Zach casts Deflecting SWAT for its alternate cost, targeting Peer. Remora and Esper trigger, and in response, Zeb pays 2 to cast Soul Partition through Citadel, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Peter draws. Remora is exiled, and still in response, Zeb pays 2 life to cast Fracture through Citadel, targeting Peter's Mana Crypt. Crypt is destroyed, then Zach pays for Esper, and then Peter draws from Remora. Then SWAT resolves, changing the target of Peer from Zeb to Zach. Then Peter draws from Remora, then Peer into the Abyss resolves. Zach loses half of his life and draws 44 cards. Zeb casts Orzhov's Signet. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Lotho. Zach takes it, and Zeb ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Chrome Mox. Esper triggers, and in response, Zach casts Snap, targeting Lotho. Esper triggers, and Nick draws again. In response, Peter casts Dark Ritual. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter flashes in, and Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, pings Lotho, killing it, and Peter amasses Orcs 1. Then Snap fizzles, and Nick draws from Esper. Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, and Peter amasses 1. Then Chrome Mox resolves, and Peter imprints Final Fortune. Next, Peter casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship. In response, Peter taps Mana Confluence to cast Demonic Consultation. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Consult. Then Fierce counters Wheel, and Peter passes the turn. Nick draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Esper triggers, Nick draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, then Peter amasses 1. Jetmir is countered, and Nick moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Facebreaker, Zeb with Sentinel, and Peter with Avacyn's Pilgrim. They all take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Nick casts Archon of Valor's Reach, naming instant as it enters. He casts Birds of Paradise, and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tymna. Zeb takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, and Peter amasses 1. Zach plays a Plateau for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 9 treasures. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Zach creates 9 more treasures. He channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Archon back to Nick's hand. Zach casts Silence. Esper triggers, and Zach pays. Then Silence resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Zach casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Grim Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and then loses 3 life. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up another card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zach casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun set of games tonight. Congrats to Peter and Zach on their wins. In Game 1, Peter was able to pull off a very tight line, even through disruption. In Game 2, Zach's Deflecting SWAT came in at the perfect moment and he was able to steal the win. The most valuable card in tonight's games, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Sardian Avenger. This card made it so much more difficult for Peter to combo off and win. The heavy use of treasures in CEDH makes this card so much more powerful. People have to watch their life totals more closely, and it can even alpha strike a player if they are not careful. It is a very cool card that doesn't see enough play. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.